Okay, hello everyone, and a very warm welcome to this month's CRAE webinar. My name is Laura Crane, and I'm the Interim Director of the Centre for Research in Autism and Education, or CRAE, and we are based at UCL's Faculty of Education and Society at University College London in the UK. And at CRAE, we conduct autism research, but really importantly, we aim for our research to be on topics that matter to autistic people and their allies, and that really genuinely make a difference to their day-to-day lives. And we take a very participatory approach in all that we do, so trying our best to involve the autistic and broader autism communities in our work at multiple levels. And at CRAE, we have a particular commitment to ensuring that academic research is shared beyond academia, and to ensure that everyone can engage with both our work, but also that of other researchers and advocates as well. And that's one of the reasons that we run our CRAE webinar series. And at this point, I'd like to say a particular thank you to all of our funders, supporters and team members who make these events possible, and particularly to the Pears Foundation, who very generously support our work at CRAE, and without whom these kinds of events just wouldn't be possible. So that's a little about us and our centre. And now I'm very, very pleased to welcome our speaker today, the incredible Dr. Monique Botha. Monique is a Leverhulme Early Career Fellow at the University of Stirling, where they're leading a research project entitled Fragile Knowledge, Dehumanization and Interpretation Bias in Autism Research. And I think I first learned more about Monique's work when I watched a talk that they gave for Academy about autistic stigma and minority stress. And it was just one of the best and most passionate and powerful talks about autism that I've ever watched. It was really, really incredible. And it was one of those talks that I really reflected on a lot afterwards. And I had a very similar reaction when I read Monique's brilliant article in Frontiers in Psychology, entitled Academic, Activist or Advocate, where Monique reflected on whether the autism research field is hospitable to autistic involvement. And again, it's just a paper that had a really huge impact on me, as one that was really powerful and important. And I think it's a paper that every person who's interested in or involved in autism research should read, particularly people who don't identify as autistic themselves. And for those reasons, we're really, really thrilled that Monique agreed to present some of their work with us today. So if any members of our audience have any questions for Monique, you can either put these in the Q&A, or if you prefer to post them anonymously, there's a website called Slido, and the link to the Slido for anyone who wants to use it will be going in the chat shortly. So a huge thank you again, Monique, for agreeing to deliver our CRAE webinar this month, and we really look forward to your talk.
Wonderful. So thank you for that exceedingly kind introduction. I'm like, whew, bit of pressure to live up to now. I'm just going to share my screen. Wonderful. So might as well jump straight in. I'm going to be talking about the construction of autistic people by autism researchers, and it's based on a mixed method study. So this comes with a trigger warning to begin with. I'm going to be discussing some of the dehumanizing and stigmatizing ways that autism researchers talk about autistic people, and actually it is pretty grim, so people should go in knowing that it could affect their mental health. And although this is undoubtedly a really important topic, it's okay to step back and look after yourself. So a bit about me, because I think it's really important to know about positionality. I'm an autism researcher at the University of Stirling, and as Laura said, I've just started an early career fellowship for a project looking at the field of autism research, particularly with a focus on dehumanization. I did my PhD and MSc at Surrey, and before that I did social care practice in Ireland. And I worked as a practitioner with autistic children, young people and their families in community settings for a number of years. So this project, bear in mind that this is going to be a snapshot and I cannot tell you everything because it's a surprisingly big project. But the overall aim was to understand the narratives that autism researchers have about autism, autistic people, and autism research, including potentially stigmatizing or dehumanizing constructions they may hold. And also to investigate whether the inclusion of autistic people throughout the research process reduces the potential frequency of this stigmatization. This is just a note to say that a lot of the results will probably make you say, well, duh, especially if you're autistic. I am not the first person to bring this issue up, like, by any means. And actually, we talk about this a lot. It's just that a lot of the time we don't have a big platform and people don't necessarily listen to us. So why does this research actually matter? Well, scientists and researchers hold immense power, especially over controlling the direction, allocation, and use of very extraordinarily large sums of money that get spent on autism research. But also, we're responsible for creating ideas of autistic people that will be reproduced in societal and cultural structures, including the media, including having access to writing articles for, let's say, The Guardian, and that will reproduce an idea of autism that goes into the general public. This includes creating ideas of autistic people which may strengthen or limit the epistemic authority afforded to us by others. What I mean by this is, if you go out of your way to make this idea that autistic people cannot reflect on themselves or others, you're limiting other people's notions of how much we can tell you about our own lives. Importantly, our lives, both physically and socially, are quite literally in the hands of researchers and how they decide to construct us. They will be the people, or we are the people, who limit or expand people's notions of what it means to be autistic. And here's the thing, the field of autism is full of deeply contested issues. At a fundamental level, we haven't agreed of what autism is, the reality, the ontology, but also we haven't necessarily agreed on who can tell you about autism and what is a reliable source. Some people have even said, for example, that autistic people can't be reliable sources of information on autism. Similarly, where the focus of autism research should be, funding priorities. And what you see is that there tends to be this big gap between autistic people and their families and researchers and what they want, even down to the fact that researchers don't necessarily make sense of autism in the same way that autistic people do. If you look right on the surface level, we don't even use the same language, with autistic people tending to prefer autistic rather than person with autism, for example. And the thing is, autistic people do tend to have more accurate ideas of autism, and also less stigmatizing. And this gets further reflected in funding priorities, for example, where a lot, the vast majority of funding gets spent on biological, simple science research, whereas autistic people tend to want things that address things like mental health, social issues, and families tend to want things around intervention that make everyday living easier. But what about stigmatizing and dehumanizing language? Well, there is actually a lot of the time a very deep violence in how we talk about autistic people. And again, I'm not the first to raise this issue by any means. And I wrote about it in the aforementioned autoethnography. So, for example, in this quote, "The person with autism's difficulty is more profound, making the possibility of identifying with the community more daunting. While it is true that communities of persons exist, disabled communities," sorry, the video's in the way. "Disabled or otherwise, it is not the case that a community of autistic people is one of them. There is not, nor could there be, a community of autistic people, since a failure of mind would preclude being part of any community. Autistic integrity seems more akin to the type of integrity informing environmentalists' familiar demands for consumer and communal responsibility towards non-human animals." these are just like two quotes that demonstrate deep, pervasive dehumanization of autistic people. And like I could put up 100 quotes. I put a lot in the article, but actually I think it would be very hard for anyone to argue that there isn't stigmatizing language used in autism research. And I know that whenever I say this, people want to say, but not all autism research. Well, everyone here at this talk could probably point to a researcher that does good humanizing work, but that doesn't mean that the field is not built upon the objectification and dehumanization of autistic people, because it is. That descriptions of autistic people in research are not more generally an active form of research-based violence, because they are, and that tackling stigma and prejudice in society with research isn't pointless when research is an active generator of it. We can do all we want to figure out how to tackle stigma, but when we are generating it, it's also slightly pointless. So that's how I arrived at this work, essentially. This method, it is a mixed method study. We looked at things like language preferences. We asked 5 open-ended qualitative questions from describe what autism is, describe autistic people, asking people what the goal of autism research should be. We asked how participatory their research degree was using Einstein's, I can never say the name, Einstein's ladder of participation. So everything from no involvement up to citizen control. And to reach a diverse range of disciplines and research areas, we also used targeted recruitment, because if it was just our bubble, it would probably look very different to the wider field. And this was a research poster. So the analysis plan, we did top-down analysis for the quantitative part of the study. So we wanted to look at whether positioning, so medical versus social orientation, would predict higher odds of the presence of stigmatizing or dehumanizing cues, whether being higher up in the ladder of participation would predict the lower odds of the presence of stigmatizing cues, and whether this was the case once controlling for both familial and non-familial contact with autistic people or length of research career. For the qualitative, we did an inductive thematic analysis on how autism researchers conceptualize autistic people and autism research. The difference in the end, by the way, is that for the quantitative, there were some people who filled in the majority of the qualitative questions but didn't provide demographic data. And given that some of the people are like, no, I'm worried that I'll be identifiable from what I've said, we can also really understand that. So we couldn't include them in the quantitative analysis, but we could in the ground up qual analysis. We had a good mix of participants from country, but it was predominantly the westernized countries that you tend to see in autism research. There was a mix of career stages from, first of all, non-academic people who do autism research all the way up to senior researchers. And there was a good mix of fields, including things like medicines, humanities, sciences, which are non-psychology, and then psychology and education. And people covered a whole range of different research areas. In terms of language preference, 57% said that they preferred identity language for their personal preference, 13% said person first, 30% had no preference. And you can see that there's a bit of a difference here, because the language most often used in their research, 59% said identity first, 28% said person first, 7% said they use person on the autism spectrum, and 5% said they use another term. In terms of participation, 20% of the researchers were autistic, 43% said that they did participatory research, which were a little bit not necessarily skeptical, but think there might have been a social desirability bias here. But you can see the others below. So again, for the quantitative analysis, first, Eilidh and I separately coded the open field questions for assigning people into narrative. And I'll go through exactly what was involved, and coding for cues of stigma or dehumanization. We did it separately and then coded into coder reliability. Wherever there was disagreement, we sat, we talked. Where we couldn't come to an agreement, and it was only the case on 3 people, these then went with our coding to someone outside of the project who decided, or basically broke the tie. Then we did hierarchical logistic regression to see what predicted cues of stigma and dehumanization. First, adding length of career, then adding familial and non-familial connections, before lastly adding the narrative and the degree of participatory research. So in terms of orientation quotes, so for example, the medical model, impairments in social communication with stereotyped and repetitive behaviours beginning early in development. It has a high variable manifestation, with some individuals nonverbal and lacking self-care capacity and others able to function extremely well. So that would be an example of the medical model. Social model. Growing up autistic attracts stigma and stress to the individual and also their family. This is because of prejudice, intolerance, and lack of reasonable accommodations. Then there was a third category, which we've termed almost neutral embodiment, which basically puts it still in the autistic individual, but it's neutral. There's no value judgment. So a neurodevelopmental difference that impacts my social and sensory world, and autism is part of a constellation of ways of being. So this screen's about to be dense, so I'm going to walk through it. What makes a cue dehumanizing or stigmatizing? So dehumanization, based on the work of Haslam, included denial of full humanness, infantilization compared to non-human animals, treated as lacking in rationality, refinement, cultural inability, passivity, fungibility, or machine-like comparisons. An example quote is, autism people may demonstrate an apparent absence of empathy for people's feelings, lack of responsiveness, awareness of social cues or cultural norms. Objectification, which was based on the work of Lacroix and Prato, and it was about instrumentality, denial of autonomy, inertness, voilability, ownership, denial of subjectivity, or again, fungibility. So for example, without often comorbid intellectual disability and dependent upon the severity of their autism, they are interesting, often charming and valuable members of the community. So as you can see there, it was the fact that the autistic person's value is based upon their instrumentality and whether or not they have intellectual disability or their dependence on other people. And it's the fact that there is, dependent on these things, these people might be valuable. And then stigmatizing includes strongly stereotyping, risk-based language, strong othering based on normative expectations. And a quote, shut down from the world, rigid, emotional, bad. Don't fully know how to make sense of that other than to know that that would be stigmatizing, just especially the shut down, don't really exist in this world, the just rigid, emotional, and the lack of rationality actually there. But yeah, we were worried about social desirability pervading so much that people wouldn't necessarily write the same things that they'd write if it weren't a study, but it turns out that people still did, and it was actually horrific. So the quantitative results, to remind you again, model 1 is length of career, model 2 is familial and non-familial connections. Model 3 is the narrative and ladder of participation. So the first model, and I'll walk through the numbers so it shouldn't be too complicated to get, but essentially, increased years in autism research positively predicts higher odds of the presence of stigmatizing cues. So this might mean that there is progress, and that things maybe are, there are less stigmatizing ideas of autism coming through, or it could point to the fact that you get institutionalized into certain ways of talking about autism. Model 2, years in autism research still predicts higher odds of stigmatizing and dehumanizing cues. Interestingly, non-familial connections here predicts a significantly lower odds of having stigmatizing cues. So this means that the more non-familial contact that people have with autistic people, the lower the odds of having stigmatizing or dehumanizing cues. Interestingly, familial connections was not significant. So having those family connections didn't predict a lower odd. But by the time you include narrative and degree of participatory research, these other variables are no longer significant. So what this means is that the social model and neutral embodiment models both predict lower odds of stigmatizing cues in people's narratives of autism and autistic people. Similarly, so does the degree of participatory research. The more autistic people are involved in the research of that person, the lower the odds of having stigmatizing and dehumanizing cues in their narratives of autistic people. What about the qualitative results? Well, so first of all, I'm going to give a warning that these are very, very preliminary. We haven't finalized this yet. We're in the middle of doing it. But these are some of the things that are notable and will also help to understand the quantitative results. So the narratives reflect the core disagreements of the field. Language like disorder, difference, disease, condition, neurodivergency, minority neurotype, and disability were all used to describe autistic people and autism, and people relied heavily on, for example, the medical model notion of autism, but there were actually quite a few accounts that actually described autistic people in more neutral terms, in terms of being a minority group, in terms of disability. So it wasn't just a blanket, this is disorder or disease. What's really important is the locus of suffering and impairment. The narratives which tended towards disorder and disease, interestingly, it placed autism as exclusively within an individual and yet managed to make that individual completely amorphous, referring to autism and not an autistic person. And simultaneously, it was like suffering and impairment was almost exclusively within autism, the label, the amorphous object, and that it radiates suffering out into those around the autistic person. So for example, autism is a neurodevelopmental disorder characterized by a wide array of social communication deficits, repetitive and restrictive behaviors, accompanied by a series of comorbid conditions. It may severely impair the life of the affected subject as well as that of his or her relatives. And you can see what I mean about it becomes autism. The person is almost erased. We're not talking about autistic people, we're talking about autism, and the suffering radiates outwards from autism. Where the narratives tended towards disability, neurodiversity, or autistic people as a neuro minority, it stressed the humanness of the autistic person. It still often placed autism within a person as genetic identity, but this is really important. It placed the impairment, the suffering and disablement primarily outside of the autistic person and into society, environment, and culture. So for example, It's the society we live in, the lack of support available, and the ableist, heavily gendered expectations that exist, which affect autistic people on a daily basis and lead to autism being described so negatively, even by other researchers. And as you can see there, it's autistic people, not autism. So it is still centered there in the person, but the disablement, the pain or the suffering is placed in society as barriers, which is what you would expect from all social constructions. In terms of understanding the cause of autism, well, it's complicated. Researchers primarily pointed to epigenetics. For example, the etiology of ASD is heterogeneous, but there is a general agreement on genetic components of ASD. ASD has been associated with more than 444 identified gene variants. However, only 30% of cases are clearly linked to genetic causes, leaving the majority of the factors unknown. It has been proposed that ASD is caused by interaction between nutritional factors and multiple genes. So the reason I underline nutritional factors there is that there were many things that people put in place of the environment, but a lot still hinged on the genetics. There were like nutritional factors, low birth weights. There was a lot that put it on maternal pregnancy factors, very little that put it on paternal, which is interesting. But yeah, lots of different environmental factors that people put there, but there was tended to almost always be a genetic part. Another quote, scholars have also acknowledged the role of the gene X environment interaction in the development of autism. But here's the thing, there was a lot more certainty around what does not cause autism than there was with what does. If I knew that answer, I'd have a Nobel Prize. There is no known cause of autism, despite a huge amount of research funding and time being invested in the question. It's definitely easier to answer the question of what doesn't cause autism, poor vaccinations and poor parenting being particularly notable. And autism is not caused by vaccines or maternal behaviors towards the child. And this is really interesting because a lot of the data was like, we don't really fully know, we're a bit unsure, but it's certainly not this. And it was very much the case that it is certainly not vaccinations and it is certainly not parents' behavior towards the child, especially refrigerator mother. But also, and this is important, this question also doesn't or shouldn't necessarily matter to a lot of people. I have no interest in understanding the cause. I want to know how we can best support autistic people in ensuring equitable access to resources, community services, employment, etc., and helping to turn the conversation to changes the non-autistic community must make to facilitate the support, understanding, inclusion, and respect. And humanity is the cause of autism. Humans are diverse by definition. The very nature of diversity and humanity yielded the neurodiversity of autism. And what a lot of these answers stressed is that the cause of autism is existence, and the cause of autism similarly shouldn't matter because we should be so busy trying to figure out how to best support autistic people. And, you know, personally, I'd probably err on this side. Just a little note, because I'm like, it doesn't really matter why we're here. What matters is how to make sure that we have a good life while we are. Now, this gets on to something that's really important, which is quality of life sounds very nice and fluffy, but there's always a qualifier. And this becomes a distinction. So there was research which tackles autism. This is the idea of disorder inside a person from which inherent suffering and impairment radiates. In that case, autism research should understand the genetics of autism-associated neurodevelopment. This may ultimately lead to screening, genetic counselling of parents, and potentially the prevention, researching the collateral benefits of treatment for individuals with autism and their families and other relevant persons. And if we think about this idea of autism and suffering radiating outwards, this is literally, for example, arguing that we need to understand the collateral benefits of, you know, if we fix the autism, it stops radiating outwards potentially and affecting the lives of the people around them. And interestingly, subtyping was very much a part of this. This includes the genetics for understanding subtypes of autism, models to understand the impact of these mutations, patient characteristics, characterization, and drug trials. Interestingly, the heterogeneity of autistic people, for people where they were focused on research which tackles autism, people who were focused very much on research as a disorder, put the heterogeneous nature of autism into autism as that amorphous object. That's why autistic people are so varied, because autism is so varied. Rather than recognizing the fundamental humanness of autistic people, and that might be why they are so varied. Whereas, on the other hand, there was research which tackles society, which interestingly placed a lot of the heterogeneous nature of autistic people into their other identities, into intersectionality, into the fact that they're human. And that's why we're so heterogeneous. And that's probably a much more humanizing take. But where disability, neurodiversity, neurominority, autism was still placed inside them, as I said, but suffering is social and environmental. So when they were talking about research, it tended to be, for example, the injustices prevalent in society are where research can make a difference. So there, it stops being research which tackles autism and starts being research which tackles society. Therefore, we should seek to involve autistic people in planning and carrying out autism research. To impact quality of life, research should consider interventions addressing socially valid outcomes for autistic individuals, as well as societal attitudes, acceptance, and systems of support. And I think this is a very big thing that people should perhaps take away from this research is, at the top, a lot of researchers were all saying the same thing, which was quality of life. But actually, their path for getting there isn't the same. And this comes through again in this next bit. So eugenics, social values, and why all of this matters. Well, where we focus today determines tomorrow. Eugenics or genetic prevention of autistic people. Someone says, if the cause of autism was known, I fervently believe this would be a terrible thing. Eugenics and social engineering, consciously and subconsciously, would take place to, I believe, autistic people to prevent autistic people from being born, or at the very least, ensure they were born with non-autistic traits. And with a lot that's happened with, for example, the Spectrum 10 case study, autistic people were painted to some degree on Twitter as being paranoid about having these concerns and being anti-science. But it's interesting because it's not necessarily unrealistic. Researchers gave that specific aim when they talked about what research should do. So, for example, someone says autism research should pursue multiple goals. Understanding the genetics of autism-associated neurodevelopment. This may ultimately lead to screening, genetic counselling of parents, and potentially prevention. And I think the main goal should be to understand what causes autism and what also impacts the trajectory of autism for individuals over their life. By understanding the former, we may be able to intervene for parents before they have a child. So you can see here how this starts to all really play out in very real terms for autistic people. Then throughout a lot of the data, there was also very much a denial of subjectivity, identity, and epistemic authority. So constructions of impairment or disablement out of the body, subscription to neurodiversity or identity was almost painted as irrational, under evidence, and rose tinted. So some persons also make the claim autism as a descriptor of a social, political, or community identity, and further make claims about uniquely autistic styles of interaction or communication. As yet, there has been little research done that would support or refute those claims. Apart from the fact that if an autistic person says, this is my identity, then what more do you need? Because autistic people have been writing about this for more than 40 years now. I mean, we've got a pretty good idea that this is how a lot of autistic people view it. So the idea that that is somehow under-evidenced shows that deep level of skepticism towards the fact that autistic people can identify differently to how research constructs autism. Some refer to autism as a conditional neurodiversity. I think it really depends on which end of the spectrum, which includes multiple dimensions, one might be. So there's that idea that neurodiversity is only for the high-functioning autistics, and that, you know, other autistic people or autistic people who experience higher needs probably can get nothing from neurodiversity. And then scientifically, autism is a neurodevelopmental disorder that has deficits in social communication and interactions and social imagination. Alternatively, autism can be seen as a difference in thinking. And there you see it posited that, you know, this is like science versus almost like this alternative anti-science notion. Neurodiversity really wasn't seen by people as being something that is, you know, challenging or worthy of challenging this over-medicalized approach. And the thing is, dehumanization and objectification of autistic people is fundamental to those goals that we talked about in terms of eradication. So I'll remind you again, dehumanization is defined as the denial of full humanness, infantilization, compared to non-human animals, treated as lacking in rationality, refinement, cultural inability, passivity, fungibility, or machine-like comparisons. And here, the focus is on removing autism as this amorphous object, not removing autistic people, because that sounds a lot less palatable, doesn't it? To say, I want to prevent autistic people. Even though these are one and the same, autism doesn't exist outside of a person, does it? And autistic people are regularly treated as passive and fungible, something that these processes can and should happen to, often for the benefit of those around them. And then instrumentality, which is, again, the denial of autonomy, voilability, denial of subjectivity, fungibility. And a lot of the time when values came up, autistic people's values to societies are often in relation to our instrumentality, that is, our usefulness in certain settings. So where people were talking about autistic people's values, they were like, you know, really good at maths and engineering, and that's great in some professions. And we go back to that original quote, without comorbid intellectual disability dependent on the severity of their autism, they're often interesting, often charming, and valuable members of society. So here we see very clear, depending on their instrumentality, autistic people might have value. And it wasn't the only quote where people were talking about values. It was almost always in relation to producing some form of workplace benefit, which is actually really grim, because it's the idea that the more disabled you are, the less you can produce for society, the less value you have inherently as a person. Now, a lot of autism researchers were exasperated with this status quo. So what research we do is often from the perspective that autistic people are worse at whatever it is than non-autistic people. More work needs to be done to develop tests and measures that aren't predisposed to fail autistic people, which I think is really important, because if you always come at the deficit, the thing is you can never find anything else. Autism research has been very outdated for a number of years, utilizing tired ideas such as extreme male brain theory. Autism research is in crisis. Non-autistic people / researchers who have dedicated decades to studying autism are being pushed out of the field. I assume they mean by autistic people who want a little bit of a slice of the action to describe themselves, but it was very much framed in terms of almost like this war, that we are pushing people out by asking for better standards. And much money is wasted on biomedical research projects that are naive, impractical, and pointless. For example, people waste time trying to find neurobiological markers of autism, but what is the point of that? You still need to find someone to discuss diagnosis with the family or individual, hopefully someone more capable of critical thought than the people who say all the value-laden, subjective, often offensive clinical discourse. But all in all, you can see that people aren't happy with the way things are, and this comes from both perspectives. People are frustrated at how little is really coming to fruition from this field. So I'm going to move on to discussion. The predominant narrative is still very much in that medicalized version of autism, but it wasn't exclusive, and there is a lot of disability narrative, neurominority narrative coming through. There was still a lot of stigmatization and dehumanization of autistic people, that idea of mind blindness lacking in reciprocity, responsiveness, and a lot of this hinged on perceived ideas of intelligence and independence. You can't necessarily talk about these things or eugenics without talking about learning disabilities and the relationship that has. It really matters how researchers construct autistic people because it changes the focus of their priorities completely. And quality of life is nebulous as a term until you ask for more context, because for, some people see quality of life is completely incompatible with being autistic. So they say, I want to improve quality of life for people with autism. And what they mean is, I want to remove the autism because I think that's where the impairment is. For other people, when they say, I want to improve quality of life for autistic people, they mean society. And they go on to specify that they want to tackle society. So when someone just says in the blank, I want to improve quality of life for autistic people, that means nothing until what they say next comes. Here's the important thing. Language cannot save you if you fail to see our humanity. Person-first language coupled with dehumanization and objectification is still dehumanization and objectification, but with more word steps. And if you're going to say something like our value is contingent on how much we can produce for someone else, it doesn't matter if you say person with autism, it's still dehumanization. And similarly, coupling identity-first language and neurodiversity light, or basing someone's value on normativity, a bell curve of intelligence, or degrees of independence is still dehumanization, objectification, and eugenics, because you're still, no matter how much you say that you really value neurodiversity, you're talking about what makes someone human and what makes them stop counting as human enough to be eradicated. We need to get to the point where the fundamental value of autistic people doesn't actually hinge on wealth production or utility to the world or neurotypical people. We should be seen as people in our own right. So autistic-led and participatory research, increased levels of autistic involvement in research did predict lower odds of stigmatization and objectification, which is important. Importantly, familial connections did not significantly predict lower odds of cues, but non-familial connections did, but that was before adding in participatory research. We cannot say for sure why non-familial did and familial didn't, but I would probably hang my hat on ideas of power and the fact that you can have a family member who may or may not be autistic, but that's not the same as actually having a friendship or relationship with someone who is. And there's also power dynamics where it might be your child or your nephew, for example. So do I advocate for participatory research? Yes. It may be key to reducing some of the stigmatization, and it may increase rigor. It's good. But also, no, not necessarily. Not right now, because the field also needs changes. Think about the quotes that I showed you all at the beginning of this talk and the ones that I showed in the results. Being autistic and doing autism research is a constant process of being othered and coming back because you want to make a difference. There isn't enough research on the effect for autistic people, but anecdotally, sifting through it is psychologically tiring at best and honestly very traumatizing at worst. It shouldn't necessarily be autistic people's jobs to withstand that amount of hostility long enough to clean up the field. That should be a joint responsibility, and primarily I witness autistic people doing it. Neurotypical researchers who work closely with autistic researchers genuinely need to acknowledge that they have a privileged position and can often do this same work without facing the same level of stress burden. So, and importantly, this is intersectional. Black people, people of color, trans and or non-binary people, working class people, sexual minorities, non-speaking autistic people, which is a huge one. All of these researchers all face intersections of marginalization and aggression in addition to ableism on top of this. In the short time that I've been peer reviewing, even, I've come across many aggressions towards minorities in the field. I recently had to review a horrifically transphobic article, and I was like, sweet Jesus, who wrote this? And that's horrific. But it means that, you know, where you are at intersections of other marginalizations, you have to face a lot more aggression in this field. So yes, participatory research, but also please take the time and put the structures in place to make sure that the autistic people who are giving their lives and their time and their energy and their own well-being to more equitable science, make sure that they're protected. It often seems like there is more protection for non-autistic academics and stagnant systems that we know don't work than there is for autistic people involved at every level of academia, and that needs to change before we end up burning out a whole bunch of autistic people. Now, this work has various strengths and limitations. You can't really give a stigma scale to researchers because we all know what it is. So this was a method of trying to get it or trying to elicit natural responses from researchers, which could then be analysed. It is an imperfect method, and we're only just trying to develop things. These were the narratives of almost 200 autism researchers, though, and that is a strength. And it is more naturalistic than just sticking a stigma scale in front of them. But social desirability and differences in interpretation could be an issue. And there was a low response rate trying to get people to take part. Future research, and this is part of my Leverhulme, I'll be doing textual analysis using machine learning to look at basically everything that has come before to the best of my ability, and this is full texts, and analysing it for things like what core disciplines and subdisciplines are being studied and how these change over time, what language is used to refer to autistic people compared to non-autistic people, how prevalent some of this dehumanizing language is over time and within certain disciplines, and also using experimental methods to understand how researchers make sense of ambiguous data, because it seems like there is always a push to framing autistic people as doing worse. But that's in the next few years and being refined and changing a little bit, but that's the overall goal, because I really think this is a worthwhile thing to do. I want to briefly give my thanks to a lot of people. So Eilidh Cage for her collaboration and support on this project, and my Leverhulme been absolutely invaluable and incredible. And importantly, all of the incredible collaborations that I've had in the last couple of years, because there are a lot of autism researchers where I get an immense joy out of working with them because they are doing incredible things for the field. And I'm really lucky to be working with some people who make autism research a lot more humanizing, and it is the thing that keeps me going. And lastly, the SGSSS, I always struggle saying that for some reason, the ESRC and the Leverhulme for obviously funding and providing funding for disseminating this research. And that's it.
Wow. Thank you so, so much. It was just an incredible talk. It was particularly cool for me as someone who took part in the research study to kind of see the findings as well. But I just want to read a comment that came in from the chat from Louisa, because I think their comment just really sums this up, which is to say that they're so, so grateful for the incredible research, and particularly the personal labour that must have been involved in delving so deeply into the challenging and dehumanising narratives. And I would completely echo that. And I can see from all of the comments that we've had and the questions that have come in that I think it's really resonated with so many people. So a huge thank you for doing the work and for sharing it as well. We have a lot of questions. I'm going to try and get through as many as I possibly can.
Okay.
The first is a methodological question. So they said, can I clarify if the project is grounded in social constructionism? And if yes, how does the quantitative arm get reconciled into this epistemological stance?
So that's really easy. It is not. It is based in critical realism. And I've just actually had a paper out on critical realism that talks about it as a solid middle ground for trying to reconcile quantitative and qualitative work. But importantly, and this is a very important distinction, this work will tell you nothing about the ontology of autism. It isn't about the reality of what autism is. The only thing this work can tell you about is the epistemology of autism, which is the way that people make sense of it, in particular researchers. So yeah, but that's, can I direct someone to a different paper? I'm like, please go read it. Because I'm, technically not a 100% social constructionist. I would put myself at critical realism, because otherwise it can be really hard to reconcile qualitative and quantitative analysis, but it shouldn't need to be. So.
Brilliant, thank you. Another question's come in saying that this person was interested in the mention of subtyping that came up, and there's been a big Lancet commission recently, obviously, around the potential introduction of the term profound autism. They wondered what you thought about that, and potentially how do we challenge those ideas?
So it was really interesting because it didn't often come up in the data, but where it did, a lot of the subtyping was very much about trying to fit autistic people, or actually more real is trying to fit autism into categories. And personally, the way that I saw it was that it almost reflects the lack of humanity that we give autistic people, because we think any variation between autistic people is about autism. It's about how heterogeneous the label it is. Oh, it must be multiple conditions. Oh, it must be that there is this category, that category, whatever. But actually, it just means that we fail to recognize that autistic people vary from each other by the fundamental humanness of them. If you were to put 100 non-autistic people in a room and say that they varied from each other, you would be like, no, duh, they're human. If you put 100 autistic people in a room and say they vary from each other, you're like, oh, it must be that, autism isn't one label. And you're like, no, it's because you have Black autistic people, white autistic people, autistic men, autistic women, autistic non-binary people. You have autistic people who thrive in one environment and can't function as well in another environment because there are environmental factors that change the way that, their autism interacts with the world, which we know. And with many other disorders, we're happy to accept, their heterogeneous nature by fact of, there is a human attached. But for some reason, we seem so determined to subtype autism because we want it to be neat, but it's human. It can't be neat. And also, I think it reflects the fact that we think that people will stay relatively stagnant. The autism, if there are these subtypes, the autism that I would have been diagnosed with as a child wouldn't be the autism I'd be diagnosed with today, and people point to me and they say, well, you know, they've got a PhD, so they're not really autistic. And I'm like, but you wouldn't have said that when I was 3. And it's a whole bunch of different factors that went into that, and it's got very little to do with my autism and more to do with the support that I was provided. But I have very strong feelings on that. In terms of what we can do to combat it, honestly, I really don't know, because there's a lot of structural power there. Autistic people don't have the same access to, I don't know, writing articles for The Guardian and saying that they come out of, you know, an Ivy League university or the British equivalent, which means that you don't have the same, you know, title necessarily behind your name to have that power in terms of changing what other people think. But having said that, that sounds nihilistic. There is strength in telling our stories, and there is strength in autistic narratives and the collective narratives that autistic people have. So continuing to make social change by just telling our stories as a collective is really important. And regardless of what anyone else is out there doing, making space to provide that dissent is really important.
Brilliant, thank you. We have another question. I'm conscious I just want to get to as many as possible because so many people want to ask you about this work. Was the level of stigma and dehumanization, etc., at the level that you expected, more, less?
So it was across 60% of the accounts. So yes and no. I could have done with it being less frequent, not gonna lie. But there was social desirability, and you could see this come out because there were a few times where people would list very positive traits, and the traits like honesty, kindness, passion, and then say things like, that's what makes it very hard for me to work with them. And you're like, you've just listed these really nice things and then made it about being difficult. And that's where you could see some social desirability come in, which is one of the reasons that I wanted to do something on the literature as it stands, because then there isn't that same opportunity to kind of like, I don't know, basically spray perfume on your really shit attitudes towards autistic people, which I think did come across a little bit. However, having said that, it wasn't across all the accounts, and some people were very ready to dehumanize and stigmatize autistic people and had no qualms about that. So yeah.
I must say, at several points during your talk, I think my jaw dropped to the floor. You know, I mean, I know myself as an autism researcher who doesn't identify as autistic, you know, I need to do better. I have made progress. There's more I can do. But someone put in the chat, sweet Jesus, and I was like, yep. Which brings us to another question. Should non-autistic people even be conducting research in the field of autism?
Yes, I 100% think they should, but they should always be doing it in collaboration with autistic people once they make sure that they've developed a system of keeping autistic people safe. Autistic people can't do it all, and this is really important. And autistic people are already at a disadvantage here because, you know, and yes, there might be an overrepresentation of autistic people who end up having PhDs, but we're also a lot more likely to drop out of school and be excluded from school. We're less likely to end up in this position. I fundamentally believe that we need allies, but I think we need allies who aren't behaving badly, so to speak. And I think a lot of allies can think that either because they know an autistic person or because they've got an autistic child that they can possibly be responsible for reproducing ableism. And what we really need is non-autistic allies who are willing to put in the reflexive work to create humanizing autism science, and to actually move over and provide space for autistic people to take charge. So sometimes that means being an ally who takes the back seat, and there is power in that. So I'd very much push towards that. I think we need that, but we also need it to be done properly, because there are a lot of people who say that they're allies and then produce very dehumanizing accounts, and that's saying that you're giving with one hand but actually taking with the other. So
But I think particularly if people reflect with your, I mean, certainly for me, just reflecting on your work has had a huge impact on me, and I hope it does to lots of other researchers as well. And I just want to
Thank
emphasize
you.
that I think, you know, your work is really making a difference, and I'm a huge fan. So there's another question that's come in that I'd really like to ask, because, you know, it's something that I would like to know more about in particular. But someone has said, can you share some protections for autistic researchers that you know of? And I'd be particularly interested in things that you think non-autistic allies could do in that sphere as well.
That's funny because I know very few. So I'm here, I'm saying, you know, we need better systems. I don't necessarily know what they look like yet. I'm trying to work that out for myself. I won't lie, I'll be very honest that my own career has been, I won't like, remarkably traumatizing in some ways in terms of how I was pulled into autism research. I think one of the best things that I've seen lately was a non-autistic, and this is so simple, a non-autistic autism researcher taking a stand on Twitter and being like, no, this is not acceptable. This is why it's not acceptable. Listen to autistic people. That is a structure. And the reason that that is a structure is because autistic people are always sticking their necks above the pulpit, because we tend to have strong beliefs and be like, actually, that's not right. But we take a lot of damage. So actually being more vocal when you see something that is either dehumanizing, inappropriate, and actually saying, you know, that's not okay, we need to do this differently, is a really important part. Aside from that, I think embedding things like supervision into work so that you can debrief and be like, well, I read this horrific thing, but at least we can sit and talk about it and laugh about it and make fun of the fact that someone described autistic people like this. And, you know, imagine, and it sounds really silly, but just even saying, yeah, imagine I'd rather be autistic than actually have opinions like that, so I'm doing fine. But having a space to debrief and unpack some of those emotions is really important. But mostly, I think reciprocity. Autistic people give our lives to research a lot of the time, and just having someone give back, recognize that we are, and making adjustments to research, because a lot of the time autistic people are asked their opinions, but nothing ever changes. And I think that that's a really horrific thing, because you've taken this energy and resource from autistic people, and then you've said that it's not even important enough to use it. So the biggest thing is just actually listening and adapting, and making that a common part of research.
Brilliant. I'm conscious of the time, but I just want to finish with one final question. So apologies to everyone whose questions we haven't been able to ask, and there were so many. Yeah, I said the talk really resonated. But I wondered if we could finish with, are you optimistic that we may see a shift in research soon, thanks to efforts that you're doing and that other researchers are doing in the field?
I really, this is a tough one. So usually I would say maybe it's that I try, this is a bit very honest, maybe it's that I try to protect myself. So the idea of having hope also means taking it really hard when certain things happen. I was really disheartened to see the article hit the media about subtyping specifically, because we know what's happening with things like Spectrum 10K. We know that it's someone using a platform that autistic people don't have to change public minds. We're not oblivious. And it seems like an abuse of power. And I want to be optimistic and I want to be hopeful, but this whole move towards profound autism, this whole move to exclude people, to make a special category based on a bell curve of intelligence, essentially, I think that's horrific. And it's working, because we aren't at the point yet where autistic people are necessarily given the same space or heard. I think we are being heard more, and I think that the work of autistic people is incredible. autistic people and autistic activists and advocates put in so much work, and I recognize that that is the thing that gives me hope. But there's also a lot happening on the other side that makes me look at it and think, you know, sometimes it does feel like it's running on a treadmill. Everyone's putting in a lot of effort and we're not necessarily getting to the destination that we deserve to be at. But I don't know whether that's also really nihilistic and everyone's now like, thanks.
I think something that came out from your talk was about years in research predicting so the longer you're in research, the kind of more stigmatizing and dehumanizing attitudes. And for me, I think that gave me a little bit of optimism there, that actually, you know, more established researchers do have this responsibility to move with the times, and actually maybe the tide is shifting and hopefully quicker, you know, a little bit more quickly. But and the fact that there is more kind of autistic involvement in research and that really does seem to be key to this as well, I think is really encouraging. So let's hope. But I'm going to finish there and just thank you again, Monique, for such an incredible talk. Thank you also to the Cray team for all of your support behind the scenes, and a big thank you to everyone who took the time today and provided comments and questions. Please do take a look at our website, cray.ioe.ac.uk, for details of future webinars. And our next webinar is by Joris Lechen on autism and psychological colonialism, and that will be taking place on Thursday, the 4th of March at 4 p.m. We really hope to see you there. Thank you.
Thank you.